very much for the introduction. Thank you to IAHTM for having me under these circumstances. So they obviously are not ideal for anybody. I'll just ask everybody if you can mute your lines. How many times have we heard that over the last 8 months, right? But if you can mute your lines, it would be appreciated so that everyone could hear properly. Thank you, IAHTM. Thank you, group. Of course, we all wanted this to be in person, but I guess we will do the next best thing, and I'm happy to host everyone in my living room. So thank you for joining. Before we begin, I just wanted to say to the group, thank you for everything you guys have done over the last 8 months. I know it hasn't been hard for anybody. But especially those of us working in this healthcare industry. I mean, you know, it's not every day where PPE is on the nightly news, you know, on a day-by-day basis. And none of us, I think, want to see that on the nightly news. And we're going to go through today a little bit as to why, you know, those kinds of things happened, why there was a shortage, and where we're at today. But I want to thank you all for the dedication that you put into our industry. To promoting reusable textiles, which I think is as relevant today as it ever has been, and if not more relevant today than it ever has been. And so thank you to all of you, and especially you know, keeping your employees employed. There's so many people today, and we're going to look at that as well in this presentation, that aren't fortunate to have a job or steady work or steady pay. And so thanks for everything you're doing and everything you're doing for your employees and your communities. So I really appreciate it. And I know our industry doesn't get enough thanks. So here I am giving it to all of you. So today we're going to be talking about the state of textiles. And so it's really like a look at the supply chain in a global pandemic. And so those of you who have heard me give this type of talk in the past, it'll be very similar to the way that I've structured my past presentations, but with a little bit of a spin today, because, you know, today we're dealing with something that no one, I think, has ever dealt with in our lifetimes. And so it absolutely has rocked the not only the reusable institutional textile industry, but supply chains in general throughout the world. So we're going to touch a little bit more broadly on supply chains in general, and then go down specifically into our industry. Questions are welcome. The way we're going to do it is if you have a question and you don't want to forget it, you can send a private message to Christy. She'll record the message, and then I'll try to address them at the end of the presentation, and I'll try to answer to the best of my ability as we go, okay? All right. So here's what we're going to talk about today. So as usual, we're going to talk about the cost inputs of interest. So that is basically what people want to know is where are costs at and where are they going, more importantly, in the future. So we're going to analyze that a little bit. We're going to talk about the PPE shortage in North America, why that happened, and what that meant for our industry. Talk a little bit about planning for the next pandemic, which we all hope never happens, but I think we've all learned that we have to do some sort of preparation for the next. And then I'm going to touch just a little bit on politics, since we are 5 days away from a US general election. And so how can we not talk about it? And so, and I see Brendan, I'm not going to ask you to hit the comment, it's okay. What I'm not going to do is go into anything in too big of a detail on it, but I think it's important because, you know, one of the caveats to this entire discussion is you can throw all of this content, all of this information out the window, depending on what happens on November 3rd. And I don't think anybody really knows what's going to happen. So I'm just going to look at it from a global trade perspective and just highlight some of the differences between the two major political parties and what that could mean for our industry and for supply chain in general. So don't worry, there should be no debate on facts. So cost inputs of interest. Again, I'll just remind everybody, please keep on mute for everybody's benefit. So cost inputs of interest, we're going to be talking about cotton, polyester, and labor. Those are the three primary ones. And I'm going to add another cost input of interest, which I don't usually talk about, which is transport. because transport has been a real roller coaster of a ride over the last 8 months. So in terms of cotton, here's a little snapshot of what happened since last November. And so cotton was actually at a relatively high price point going into the pandemic. So you can see there, November, December, January, it was rising. And then, of course, what happened is, since cotton is traded on the commodity markets, along with the rest of the stock market, cotton prices plummeted. And so while usually when there is, global issues that affect the commodities market, it doesn't really represent the reality of what's happening in the cotton market. So it's a little bit separated between what's happening in the market, in the exchange, and what's happening in reality. But this time around, it actually did quite reflect the state of the cotton industry in the world. So along with a lot of other products in the world, the demand for cotton-based items significantly declined once the pandemic hit. And so whenever that happens, what happens is pricing plummeted. And so a lot of what occurs in the healthcare institutional market is a mirror image of what happens in the apparel market. And so a lot of our data, a lot of our factories, for instance, actually produce mainly for apparel and some healthcare textiles. And that's just reality, right from the cotton fields to yarn spinning to actually cut and sew production, et cetera. And so as the global demand for apparel and cotton-based apparel products decreased, so did the price. And then what we can see happen from the big crash there is that it's gradually been increasing again. Now, whether that's sustainable or not, we'll see, because if there is a heavy-duty second wave and the market crashes again, we wouldn't be surprised to see cotton futures again dip as it did back in April, March. And so here's just a comparison: the New York price versus China, India, Pakistan. China, India, Pakistan being some of the world's largest producers of cotton. And you can see most of the world kind of mimicked what happened on the New York exchange. And so it's a real global pandemic. And so, that's one of the themes also that throughout this presentation that we should focus on, is that, oftentimes, and myself too, I'm guilty of this, is we get so ingrained in what's happening in our own little realities, And so, for example, where I live right now, they just put us back into lockdown mode. We're in what's called this red zone, where they close all the restaurants, close all the gyms, only essential workers. And so, we kind of get a focus on what's happening just in our little reality. But what's important to understand is this is a global pandemic. And so what's happening on the streets of Montreal or the streets of New York or the streets of Columbus is also happening in the streets of Shanghai, Beijing, Wuhan, and countries all around the world, And so, so we can see that, as our market crashed, so did those of other countries, and cotton was not an exception to the rule there. And so just to highlight that even more, you can see in China, it happened a little bit earlier than on the New York exchange, but also cotton on the domestic market in China drastically decreased when the pandemic really started to take international notice in China. And you can see just starting there in January, the prices really came down and now have gone back up. And you can see right on the tail end there, there's a very big spike in what's happening as I think global demand starts to go back. And I'm not saying the world is getting back to normal by any means, but definitely people are shopping more, and apparel in particular is increasing once again. And whenever I show these kinds of futures graphs, I always like to remind everyone that just because there was a huge dip in the price of cotton on the publicly traded commodities market, it doesn't mean that we should immediately expect those kinds of decreases in the products that we are buying. And while that is true in most times, it's only half true, I guess, in this scenario, because the reality is that the demand for cotton-based products did go down, and we know this in our business as well. The demand for cotton-based, let's call it terry or flannel bath blankets or whatever else is based with cotton, also went down as elective surgeries were kind of halted throughout North America. And so definitely we saw the decrease in actual the price of the finished good a lot sooner than we normally would have. But in normal times, when you do see a dip in the commodities market for cotton or polyester or anything synthetic, you should expect about a 6 to 8 month gap between when you notice that dip in the market and when we could actually expect that as savings in the finished goods. And the reason is because of this. It goes from, you know, the farmers to the spinners to the manufacturing, et cetera, all the way down. And at every point in this supply chain, people are holding inventory. So, you know, farmers are stockpiling cotton, yarn spinners are stockpiling cotton to spin yarn, et cetera. And so there is a gap between what you see on the globally traded commodity index and what is reality in terms of the finished price of products. So the reality, like I said, there was a real decline in cotton consumption, actually a 12% decline. And it is entirely due to the COVID-19 pandemic, because if you look at the forecasting people, what they were saying before the pandemic hit, actually we were expecting an increase in the demand of cotton for this year. And so what actually happened is there was about a 12% decline. And as you can see, we don't really know where it's going, and nobody really knows where it's going. We don't know if a second wave is coming or not. So it's very difficult to do some of the hedging that, you know, not only George Courey does, but all of your linen vendors do. We do a lot of hedging in terms of cotton as well as currencies, etc. And it's very, very difficult to do that. So I can't say, and I don't think anybody really knows where cotton prices are going for the end of 2020 and also into 2021. What we do know is that since the cotton market did plunge, that usually means that farmers will elect to instead use their crops to grow other kinds of crops. And we haven't seen any data yet that actually backs that up, but historically that has been what happens when cotton decreases tremendously. Just like if anybody remembers back in the cotton crisis of 2008, 2009, when cotton prices skyrocketed, all of a sudden you had all kinds of farmers converting their crops to actually grow cotton and take advantage of that high price. So the same thing happens when pricing comes down. In terms of polyester, and polyester is very interesting because in our industry especially, the demand for polyester-based products increased tremendously from one year to the next, mainly because of PPE, because of the need for isolation gowns, surgical gowns, etc. And you know, this is where the big difference between disposable PPE and reusable PPE actually intertwine, because the global demand for disposable PPE definitely increased, and that I think we all know is the dominant form of PPE throughout the world. And let's not forget, we're not just talking about Canada, USA, we're talking about the rest of the world. And so the actual base of those disposable gowns is usually a polypropylene, which is also a synthetic oil-based fabric. And so it affected the polyester market. It affected the oil prices, which affected the polyester market, which affected ultimately reusable polyester yarn. And so if you go back, I don't know, for those of you that were at the ARTA event back in, I think it was in March now, which was the last time I traveled anywhere. I don't know about the rest of you. That was my last time traveling. I talked about the coronavirus pandemic in the sense of we're not sure what's going to happen within China. And the big concern was, well, a lot of our products are still made in China. So if China goes on shutdown, what does that mean for our imports? And so that was really our big worry with the coronavirus, is how will this affect China? Well, as what we see, what actually happened was it was just translated into the rest of the world once that the virus kind of spread. And you know what? This is, I don't know if this is a controversial statement or not, but I think our industry especially is very fortunate that this kind of global pandemic originated in China. And the reason I say that is because way before it ever hit the shores of the US or Canada or any other country around the world, China was dealing with this virus. And they were already starting that process of converting factories into PPE production. And so what we saw was that when we needed it the most here in North America, there already was this entire infrastructure transferred into the production of PPE, whether it be masks or disposable gowns or reusable gowns. that kind of infrastructure was already changed over. And so while that was a concern for us in the moment, and this is where this article where I took these quotes from is from March, we were worried about, well, what about all the other products that we import from China? I understand you need to convert your factories to produce PPE for what you need domestically in China, but that doesn't help us on our end. We're making underpads or making whatever else we make in China. But actually, in the long run, it significantly helped our industry and people around North America. And so what the real worry was there is that as China became locked down, that transport and different avenues to get yarn from the spinners to the producers would be compromised, and it was. And so things did slow down and got a little bit more expensive and difficult. And so what we did see is that this again is from around March when things were really just starting to happen. It did spread throughout China, and of course it spread throughout the world. But definitely it affected industries and geographic locations in China that actually are major producers of polyester, which affected the price of polyester. So if any of you saw prices go up for synthetic-based products, this is part of the reason why. And so the actual ironic thing is that Hubei province, which is where, what's the capital of Hubei province, is actually Wuhan, which we all now know Wuhan. I think most of the world didn't know what Wuhan was prior to the pandemic. Hubei province is actually the world's largest cluster of where textile printing and dyeing is done. And so once you shut that down, because of course they were shut down there, it actually affects not only production coming out of China, but it affects where production coming out the rest of the world. And so, it's amazing when you have a global pandemic of this scale, how much it really highlights how dependent the entire world is on one country to the other. And I think just looking at the microcosm of Hubei province and the city of Wuhan, and their importance in terms of dyeing and printing in the textile world, and just having that one shut down, how it affected the rest of the industry is incredible. And so, of course, any kind of prolonged disruption in the production of dyed textiles or printed textiles in the Wuhan province would have a prolonged effect on the polyester industry, and we're still not really sure where that will end up. And the big concern was with workers. And so just like in our industries and in our hometowns, there's companies going under. A lot of companies, unfortunately, had to declare bankruptcy, did furloughs. The same was happening in spinning mills around the world, and not just in China, in Pakistan as well, and in India. And the reality is that this was a measure to not only guard against the spread of infection, but also these are businesses at the end of the day. These are companies that are responsible for a bottom line. And if it made sense for them to furlough employees, they did. And so what happened is that slowed down production. A lot of the workers went back home to their hometowns and didn't come back. And so what that happened, and you'll see in a second here, is what happened to the polyester industry. And so you can see that polyester absolutely dipped again. This is the filament prices within China dipped tremendously and then slowly started to come back. And I think that's representative exactly of what happened in the entire world. But now you can see what's going on in China, and this is just a 3-month index from the staple fiber price in China. In the last few weeks there, you can see right after October, in October, that the prices start to spike again tremendously. And I think what that is indicative of is what's going on in the world in terms of PPE production, to be honest with you. So apparel is still very much not where it used to be, but the world is producing PPE now. And I'm sure all of you have seen this. There's a lot of new companies now in the industry trying to make PPE out of necessity, right? They need to have something to keep their businesses going. And so as demand for PPE increases, as countries, governments start to prepare for a second pandemic, a third, I think that's the reason why those polyester prices are increasing. Labor. Now, labor is a very, very interesting cost input for us to look at. So just generally, you can see by mid-year, I think this was in June or July, global working hours declined 17.3% in the world. 17.3%. It's an incredible number, equivalent to nearly 500 million full-time jobs. And so what I really wanted to focus on here, which I think is important for our industry, is this existence of a wage gap, okay? And wage gap, what that typically means for us here in North America is, you know, the difference in pay from female workers to male workers, or, you know, different cultures or whatever. That's not the wage gap that I'm talking about. The wage gap that actually was created out of this pandemic was this disparity between what producers of garments especially owe their workers and what was actually paid. And you can see here that there was a gap of between 3.19 and 5.78 billion US dollars, okay? And why I want to bring this up and why this is important is because we don't know what kind of effect this will have on the future of our industry and the future of apparel and textile production going forward. And here's just a few things to illustrate what I mean. Bangladesh, which is a major producer of global textiles, you can see in February there, that wage gap was at 0%, meaning all of the factory owners were paying everything out to their workers that were owed. But then in March, you can see 13% of wages weren't paid, April 46%. So when almost half of the wages you owe to your employees aren't being paid, what does that mean on will they return to work? Will they find work in other industries? And this, just to be very clear, is garment workers. And garment workers is our best indicator as to where our workers are in terms of in our production facilities overseas, because garment and healthcare textiles are pretty much within the same general field. So that's Bangladesh. If you look at Cambodia, which is also a very important producer of healthcare textiles, 30% in April and over 50 in March, in May, sorry. Incredible numbers when you see back in January, 0%, 1%. India, this one to me was the most shocking. If you look in April, in one part of India, 95% of garment workers didn't get paid. 95%. And so what I think is going to happen out of all of this is, first of all, there's a lot of factory owners who are making money and not paying out and not doing the right thing, which is also something that I've been talking a lot about over the years, which is governments don't really control businesses in these parts of the world. They're not really regulated by governments. They are regulated by customers, okay? And major customers. I'm talking the Walmarts of the world, the Targets of the world, etc. And what happened here is that these kinds of companies started to cancel orders. And when they cancel orders, and the factories have already committed to making those orders or maybe even made the goods already, the factory owners just decided, you know what, I'm not going to pay my workers. And so, you know, while I don't have numbers for this year on where our wages going, I don't think it's really relevant because no matter where wages are going, they're not being paid out to the workers. And I think that will have a major disruption in our industry as we go forward. I think I have a few others here. Indonesia, 46%, 56%, incredible numbers. Pakistan, which are a lot of our healthcare textiles are made, 75% in April, 55% in May. So a real wake-up call for the rest of the world. And there are a lot of nonprofit organizations trying to band together a group to do kind of crowdfunding to get these employees paid. It's such a band-aid to a very poor situation that, but there is a systemic issue here when if North American companies start to cancel orders, if that ends up meaning that there are garment workers that don't get paid, I don't think that's acceptable for anybody. And let's not forget that this is happening to workers that already get paid dangerously low wages. You can see here, if you look at Bangladesh, that's 95 US dollars a month is what the monthly minimum wage in the global garment industry. This is numbers from 2018. So we have to remember that these people are already not getting paid very high wages, which you know, I struggle to say it's okay, but it is okay because in the grand scheme of things, that is how the world works. You know, we import from countries where labor is less expensive, so that the world will work. If labor was more expensive, then I think a lot more production would be done closer to home. But so it's important to remember that these are already workers that aren't very well paid, and they're being even more damaged throughout the pandemic. What effect that will have on labor and on the end cost of our products, I think, is still yet to be determined. So in general, we're going to shift now into like how come this shortage in PPE actually happened. So you can see here, just to illustrate a little bit as to where the majority of our products are made, and by our I mean the healthcare manufacturing industry in general, not my company in particular. Bangladesh, Pakistan, Cambodia, these are the major players in this field. And we can see that the numbers are staggering in terms of what these countries are producing as output within the year of 2020. You can see all of those bars are facing downwards, which means major decreases across all of these very important countries for our industry. And so they talk about the financial crisis in 2008, and we can all see what happened as a result of that. I think that the world was kind of in a flux. We don't really know when our industry will recover again, because you can see those numbers, those bar charts pointing downwards. There were many factories that decided, what, we can't sustain this and we need to close down. I think in the long run, and actually in the short and medium term as well, that will have effect on our industry in terms of pricing. And that brings me to transport, which, I mean, I don't know about the rest of you, but transport was basically all I was focusing on at the early parts of this pandemic, and we can see that it's such a vulnerable part of our supply chain. Not only does it take long to get goods in normal times with sea freight, you're talking on average, 3 to 6 weeks transport time, but we can see that the vulnerabilities when there's a global pandemic is that the entire global transport industry basically shut down, and it required government to get involved and make sure that we can have a flow of goods coming, even though there was no passenger planes and things like that. And so it was incredibly volatile, and I think that our industry was hurt in the short term with having to pay these high prices, and you'll see what that means. Basically, I thought this was a good quote. The airlines basically tore up the rule book in terms of how market usually contracts. So there were, a lot of companies have long-term commitments in terms of the price per kg for air freight or cost of containers. All of that was basically wiped out. Nobody cared. And it was the Wild West for a while there. And you can see what happened in March, April, May. This is really peak pandemic when a lot of people were trying to bring in as much PPE as possible. Look at what happened to those air freight rates. It went from, between $2 and $4 a kg, all the way up to $10. And I even saw some higher than $10 there. So now we can see it normalize a little bit, back down to the $5 range. But this is a real reason why a lot of companies had to pay more for PPE in particular at that time. Now, ocean shipping as well took a hit because when a lot of the North American brands started to cancel their apparel orders, just to stay on the same theme, there was a lot of ocean freighters going back and forth with what they called blanked, which are empty, basically ships coming back from where they came from. And so that also created a huge spike in sea freight prices going forward. And so now, while I don't think, while this does affect, the end price to laundries in the short term, ultimately transport is not a major component of the cost input of a product. It is significant, but I usually don't talk about transport in these kinds of presentations because typically it's been stable, and at the end of the day, it's not a major cost input. But these kinds of increases, I think, are useful to see to be able to explain a little bit of the things that's been happening. The reason why it's come down and it is normalizing a little bit is because the capacity did increase there. So not to get into the PPE shortage in North America, and I think that I don't think I'm understating it by saying it is a shortage, and it really did start with the the disposable companies. And I think what's a great thing for our industry is that the disposable companies had a hard time keeping up with the increased demand, and it's not to their fault. I mean, these kinds of numbers nobody's ever seen before. But I think what's great for our industry is that actually resulted in a lot of healthcare systems converting into reusable, which is amazing for our industry. So here's, I think a lot of you know, maybe some of you don't know, this is actually my sales director, Matthew. And this isn't how he normally dresses, but I wanted to just say a very quick story to illustrate, you know, the PPE pandemic. So this is Matthew at one of our customers, and the customer was telling, it's a laundry, and the customer was telling us about what one of their hospital clients bought in terms of PPE. And this is actually what they bought. And this is a regular polycotton, it's a little old lady dress, right? And so that kind of really shows us where we were at that time, back in March, April, for a hospital to revert to buying this, where basically their only requirement was, you know, it needed to close in the back and have long sleeves. I think it's just incredible. And I think that while we all need to take a little bit of responsibility for this kind of a crisis and where we were at, I think that the way that the reusable PPE industry reacted to the requirements and the demand of the moment was simply incredible. It did take a little bit of time, but we got there for sure. And I told Matthew I was showing this picture, so don't worry, he's okay with it. So basically, there was a study done in 2017 where the U.S. PPE supply chain, it was shown to have minimal ability to rapidly surge production, resulting in challenges to meet large unexpected increases in demand. And so, you know, you can look back on this and say, well, of course, you know, why didn't we plan for this sort of thing? Why didn't governments stockpile more? I don't think it's fair really to say that and to blame it on governments in particular. And this is just my opinion. Because what the numbers we've seen for this year, I think, are just off the charts. And so I think it would have been hard to be able to predict this. But you know what? I'm not a global infectious disease person. And so, you know, maybe there was a way to be able to stock up a little bit earlier. But the reality is that in China, more than 3,000 companies declared force majeure, which is part of the problem, part of why it was so hard to get goods out of China. And really, when you look at it in the US, like where money was spent in terms of how to prepare and plan for a pandemic. And again, I'm not getting too political with this, but this is just facts. You know, you can see the budget for pandemic influenza is right there down at the bottom, and where more money was spent is on bioterrorism and emergency preparedness. And so while that may absolutely have been the correct decision to make if there was no global pandemic, it does explain a little bit why, at least in the US, we found ourselves in this kind of a situation. So in terms of global supplies, one second. So when we talk about global supplies here in a second, we're gonna be looking at all kinds of PPE, and so it's not just in textiles, but you know, different masks and syringes, etc. And this explains a little bit of the problem. So the top importers of medical goods in the world are United States, Germany, China, and then Belgium, Netherlands, etc. And so that compared to the top 10 exporters of personal protective products is also China, Germany, United States. You can see that the United States is heavily dependent on China. And so since China was really invoking these protectionist measures to make sure that their citizens were protected, that was the big worry as to, you know, can we get what we need from China? And so that was where a panic started to set in, and we saw a lot of domestic manufacturing starting to take place. But you know, what's interesting is that 200 of the Fortune Global 500 firms actually have a presence in Wuhan. And again, this is just kind of highlighting how important knowing where your supply chain comes from and being able to diversify, because Wuhan was hit, we all know, the hardest, and they got shut down the earliest. And I think the ripple effect of that not only infected our industry, to lack of a better word, but industries all over the world. Again, anybody who's interested, I kind of put the I went, if I took an idea from an article or even a direct quote, everything is sourced there. So this particular Harvard Business Review article, I suggest going to read. Very, very interesting. And you know what? It's all about how can we hedge against another pandemic happening. And so this is where we talk about planning for the next pandemic. And I want to start this section with a bit of a caveat. So what we experience here is what economists call a black swan event. And for those that don't know, a black swan event it's an unpredictable event. You can read it right there. I'm just moving my thing. Unpredictable event beyond what is normally expected of a situation has potentially severe consequences. Black swan events characterized by their extreme rarity, severe impact, and widespread insistence they were obvious in hindsight. And that's exactly what we're experiencing right now. And so I want to highlight, though, that extreme rarity phrase, because a lot of the questions that I've been getting from not only governments but customers and people in other industries as well is, you know, what's going to change post-pandemic in the healthcare textile industry? And my answer is, quite honestly, I don't think much. I think in the long run, not much will change. I think definitely there's been some domestic manufacturing that has increased, and my company as well. In the last 6 months, we've hired over 400 people and made over 4 million isolation gowns domestically. Never made an isolation gown domestically prior to this pandemic. And I don't think going forward, we're going to be making isolation gowns domestically, because I don't think the market can bear it. And I don't think that we should. And I think that that's the point that I'm trying to make is we shouldn't react and change our entire industry because of a black swan event. But there are things that we can do to guard against the ramifications of a black swan event that doesn't really need to disrupt the entire industry. So there's 3 things, again, from the same HBR article, which I suggest everyone check out. Identify vulnerabilities, diversify supply base, and hold intermediate or safety stock. And it seems very obvious, just like it seems very obvious that we should have had major stockpiles of PPE prior to the pandemic. But what they mean by identify your vulnerabilities is really take a look at your supply chain throughout. And let me tell you, this is what all of your vendors are doing right now and have been doing throughout the pandemic. And that means not only looking at where goods are made, but look at where your yarn is made. Look at where your suppliers are also supplying to other countries. Because don't forget, when the outbreak really occurred, USA, Canada, we're not only competing with different states within the US, for example, or Canada, different provinces within Canada, we're competing with countries around the world, you know? And so it's important to know not only where your vendors are buying from, but also where they're selling to. And I think that that's an interesting point to take away. And then identify those vulnerabilities, and where it makes sense, where it doesn't, this is my opinion, where it doesn't involve a heavy cost increase on your organization, address those vulnerabilities and do something about it. So if you see that everything is being bought from one vendor or from one part of the world, and you can diversify that without significantly affecting your bottom line, I think you should do so. And that goes into diversifying your supply base in general. And what it means in terms of the supply base is, you know, if you have goods that are being cut and sewn in Malaysia, for example, but all of your yarn is coming from China, that's good. But if everything is coming from China, I think that can cause an issue. And so one of the ways we can guard against it is to spread out that supply right through the chain. And then hold intermediate or safety stock. I know it's easy to say, and I think that it is an important point though, because especially, and I'm not saying to have laundries hold a crazy amount of inventory, because I know that that's not a reality. But you can have that conversation with your textile vendor, understand how much inventory they have at all times on hand, and know where your vulnerabilities are from that perspective. I'm going to just flip through a few slides because we are running a little bit short on time here. But I encourage you all to go read that Harvard Business Review article. Now, getting into politics, and like I said, I don't want to get too much into the details of politics, but the reality is that there is a U.S. election happening in 5 days. And I wanted to highlight one of the main differences, in my opinion, in terms of foreign policy and trade agreement. So we all know that there are two major political parties, and they both have very different views on how to negotiate internationally. And for me, the most obvious difference between the two is the Democrats' side, where they like to have these large multilateral agreements, and the Republican side, which they like to negotiate more in a bilateral perspective. And I think the two kind of scenarios that highlight this the most is the TPP agreement, which was in motion and almost adopted right before President Trump was elected, and the China trade war in which we are in now. So the TPP, just to go back onto, and the reason I'm going to focus a little bit on TPP, even though everyone may think that it's kind of defunct because it was shut down about 4 years ago, whether it's TPP or a new form of TPP, I think that this kind of trade agreement will be absolutely significant and have the biggest impact on our industry. And the entire reason is because of China. The entire reason is making sure that in my opinion, the best way to deal with China is to have a conglomerate of other countries come together and use that influence to actually influence on what's going on in China. And that's really basically what the TPP was going to do. And so it was significant because it was set to become the world's largest free trade deal. 40% of the global economy would have been affected by the TPP. So supporters of TPP, they say that a deal would have expanded U.S. trade and investment abroad, spurred economic growth, lowered consumer prices, created new jobs, advancing U.S. strategic interests in the Asia-Pacific region specifically. But detractors to it, including obviously President Trump, who didn't end up adopting the agreement, saw the deal as likely to accelerate U.S. decline in manufacturing, lower wages, and increase inequality. Now, absolutely, that could have happened. But if it was adopted, I think it would have had a profound impact on our industry. So just to highlight why, two of the countries involved in, I think there were 12 total countries involved in the TPP, were Japan and Vietnam. And Japan and Vietnam are major textile producing countries that rival China. And so while China has the advantage in terms of their overall ability to manipulate currency, as well as maintain a low standard of pay for their workers, if Japan and Vietnam became part of this free trade deal, I think it would have an enormous influence on China. And so and then if we move ahead and look at the bilateral agreement that President Trump is trying to do with China, we can see that it hurt both economies in the short run, but also the only thing it really did at the end of the day with the tariffs was accelerate importers' ability to source goods outside of China. And what I mean by, and I'll get to that more in a second, but just to finish on the TPP, so it's an enormous thing, and why it's important is because we can see here the spread among all of the, I'd like to call them the leading voices in the Democratic Party. A lot of them didn't like the TPP. A lot of them did like it. And so while we kind of try to see where the Democratic Party is going to stand on these kind of large multilateral agreements worldwide, obviously the most important person on this list is Vice President Biden there. And if we look at what he said, is that he would have liked TPP, but a different variation of it. So all that to say is, if the Democrats are victorious in November 3rd, I think we can expect some sort of large-scale free trade agreement amongst countries that will rival China in terms of textile production. So here's a direct quote from Joe Biden there. TPP wasn't perfect, but the idea behind it was a good one. Unite countries around high standards for workers, environment, intellectual property, transparency. And this is what's important, I think, about this this quote is, and use our collective weight to curb China's excesses. Okay, so that's, you know, I think we can all agree that that's kind of the Democratic stance on how to deal with China. And then if you translate that into the Trump way to deal with China, which was on tariffs. And tariffs, at the beginning of the tariffs, you know, our industry wasn't involved in phase 1, phase 2, but once it did hit, I mean, it absolutely had an impact on goods in our industry. And what a lot of companies did was diversify away from China, which actually ended up being a positive in terms of the pandemic, because to not rely on China, going back to that diversification, the need for diversification to guard against a pandemic. We had already started kind of doing that because of these tariffs on China. But in the end of the day, the reason why companies buy goods from China is because they have the specialty in those kinds of goods. And so if you're going to try to make those in other countries that don't have that kind of specialty, I think you can end up having inefficiencies, and ultimately pricing will go up. And so that's actually what did happen in the world. So this is an analysis of after the tariffs were imposed, how much did prices actually go up in the US and have the US consumer actually pay? And they actually did end up going up a lot. And I think we've seen that in our industry as well. And so, you know, the biggest question that I get asked is manufacturing coming back to the US? And so, and Canada for that matter. And so while I think that to a large degree it is, I don't think that it's sustainable if the entire reason for bringing manufacturing back to the US is this kind of anti-China sentiment. I don't think that that's a sustainable reason or business model to bring manufacturing back. And while and which is why the election is important again, because if the Democrats do come in and tariffs are removed from these goods from China, you'll see all of this diversification that textile manufacturers did because of that sort of thing to guard against these price increases will immediately go away, and a lot will start shifting back into China. And so while I think that the election will have enormous consequences on our industry, I think that in the long term, you know, you always have to have this long-term vision. I think that the market will prevail, and the market, I don't think, can support healthcare production in the US or in Canada. And so, you know, while it will help, and it does help to have this kind of network of companies that can quickly translate their manufacturing into things like PPE production, we've seen that that's been very, very important. From a sustainable business model, I don't think it really makes much sense for things like isolation gowns or even some of the more basic stuff that we use in our industry. Now, on more complicated items like surgical gowns and surgical items which have a very high cost of fabric, I think that it could make sense. But then again, we always have to look at the entire supply chain and know, you know, even if this garment, let's say a surgical gown, is being made in the US, where's the fabric coming? Where's the yarn coming from? And you know, everything from where the snaps being manufactured to the ties. If we're doing it purely from an anti-China sentiment or from a national security perspective, then all of these things need to be addressed, which is possible, but probably not probable in the long run for our industry. So that's basically what we wanted to go through today. Christy, I don't know if there's any questions, but I wanted to leave us about 10 minutes, which is what we have, so I can try to answer as many questions as I can.
I do have a couple questions here. The first one's from Brendan O'Neill. He would like to know, do you expect to see a traditional holiday shutdown in China this coming holiday, as we have seen in the past? Or given the length of this year's shutdown, will the 2021 holiday time be reduced?
It's an interesting question, Brendan. Well, the answer is I don't know. I don't think anything's kind of been announced. I don't see why it would be different than normal times. And I'll add to that with, this is absolutely not something that you, Brendan, as a laundry operator should be worrying about. This is the responsibility of your linen vendors to know, to time, you know, deliveries, time production schedules, etc., so that, you know, we have goods here for you. And I'm not saying we as in George Courey, I'm saying we as the collective we of the vendor group of our industry. And so if you do, like, it's something that your vendors should be already taking into consideration and adapting to. So whether it's shortened or lengthened, I don't think it should actually affect supply.
The next question comes from Malcolm Palace. Will the workers continue in textiles if the wage gap does not start to close?
Yeah, well, that's the whole point, Malcolm, and you hit it right on the head. That is the concern. I think that we've seen we've seen a lot of factory closures, first of all, in the textile industry. And those that are still open are almost entirely producing PPE. You know, that's really still the product du jour in China. And it all depends on the apparel industry. And it's not only a question of will they come back, but at what, you know, what kind of wages will they come back for? And will that affect the cost of our products going forward? It's a question mark. I can't answer you with any kind of certainty, Malcolm, but that's certainly the reason why I wanted to highlight that wage gap, because it is a concern.
The next question is anonymous. To what level do you think that governments need to be involved in stockpiling PPE for future health emergencies versus suppliers who must also ensure that they have stock available? Yeah. Who does the responsibility lie on at the end of the day?
Yeah, such a good question. And it's obviously a complicated one, but absolutely government needs to take some responsibility in this. And they are, and absolutely they are. I can speak for Canada. We've been working very closely with the federal government in Canada, and they are absolutely stockpiling a significant amount of goods, as well as some of the provinces in Ontario and Quebec, et cetera. But I think that, so I'm a small government kind of guy, kind of thinking. And so I don't like for any of us to really rely on government to protect us or to do anything for us for that matter. And so I think we need to, as an industry, take this in our own hands. And I think that what we've learned is that while it's important to have large scale inventories, et cetera, and you can build these kinds of requirements in your contract, but even if we go back to before the pandemic and you were to have built a requirement for any of your linen vendors to have X amount of inventory in stock, it wouldn't have been enough, because I guarantee you nobody would have predicted the levels of what we actually did need. And so I don't think that that's a perfect solution. My opinion, the best solution is to have a hybrid approach. So yes, government should be stockpiling. Yes, your linen vendors should be stockpiling. And yes, as well, laundry should be stockpiling to a degree. But then have this kind of hybrid approach where we can quickly turn it on domestically and make gowns. I don't think it on a consistent level, but have the ability to convert factories. You know, maybe predetermine this factory has been approved to produce PPE if we need to shut it down and turn it on. So that, I think that a hybrid approach is the most logical move forward.
The next question's from Tim Lasik. With many manufacturers jumping in and producing the poly fabric, we have seen varying degrees in quality at the end product. What is GC doing to ensure a consistent product?
So it's a great question, and I won't talk about George Courey specifically, because I don't think we're unique in what we do. I think it's, you know, the industry in general. But I mean, not everyone. Everyone who has been in this industry prior to the pandemic is absolutely always very concerned about quality. Now, yes, there have been some, you know, apparel manufacturers, et cetera, that have gone into the production of PPE. And I know my company has been advising and consulting with some of these companies to make sure they understand, you know, what is it to pass a PB70 test? What does it mean to have, you know, 20 centimeters of pressure? What's AATCC 42? What's AATCC 127? Like they didn't know these things. And so while I think the industry relied on the veteran companies in the industry to do that, there definitely was a concern in general about the efficacy of some of the products that were being produced. I could speak for our company, and I know a lot of our competitors that were competitors prior to the pandemic. Everyone is very, very focused on quality, especially when it comes to PPE products like this. Spot checking, but overall just making sure your process is correct. And if your process is correct, then it should result in the same kind of level of production no matter what gown you're looking at.
And your last question here is from Miles Noel. What is your crystal ball on the price of cotton over the next year?
So it's an interesting question, Mile, and of course I'm going to answer with I don't know, because I don't think anybody does. I think that in terms of the price of cotton on the commodities market, I think will definitely reflect, generalities of what happens in the stock market. So I think the election, number one, will have a big influence on the market going forward, but also the pandemic will. And if there is a major second wave or third wave and the market crashes again because we have to shut down economies, that will have an effect on the commodity price of cotton. Now, in reality, I think the more important thing to look at instead of the price of cotton is the price of yarn and cotton yarn, and that really lies within the yarn spinners in countries like China and Pakistan and India. And yarn spinners absolutely are struggling. A lot of them are shutting down because mainly of the apparel industry. And so I think that yarn prices will probably keep going up in the short to medium term. That would be my best crystal ball analysis there. All right, pretty good timing. We're right on the dot at 1 o'clock here.
Thank you, Jeff, so much for such
Awesome.
a great presentation. We all appreciate that you're doing this for the members at IAHTM, and I hope everybody got a lot out of it. If you have any questions, you can shoot me an email. We will have this eventually on the website.
Yeah, and if anybody has any questions, my email is there as well on the last slide. Feel free, you can call me, email me. I'll make myself available to everybody here. All right. Thank you, guys. Hope to see you all soon in person, very, very soon, I hope.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.